Shabbat shalom. You excited to be here? Amen. It's the greatest days to be alive. How many believe that? Amen. You're living in the days that I believe people have been looking towards and speaking of for centuries, and yet it's here. What are you going to do? Amen. And in fact, that's exactly what I believe. We talk about this all the time. We look at the weekly Torah portions, and we know that not only is it something that happened then in the past, but it's something that is actually giving you a roadmap for your future. It's telling you what is happening right now for those that will look and dig and see the scriptures come alive. And this week's Torah portion is absolutely no different. It's exactly what's happening in the house today. And I believe it's a word that's not so much contrasting what's going on in the world to what's going on in the Father's house, but it's a word where he begins to look inside his house and speak to us regarding our role in this and what will happen if we don't choose to step up to the plate. The title of this week's Torah portion is Vayashev, and it's translated as "and he settled." It's taken from Genesis chapter 37, verse 1 through chapter 40, verse 23. And you'll find that it transitions the focus from Jacob to Joseph, specific to his sons, but specifically to Joseph. And it was amazing to me because the very first song that we opened up with, it was talking about "Awake, awake, you sleeping giant." And it's speaking about the body of believers. It's speaking about you waking up. And it's a picture, I believe, of that valley of dry bones that's found there in Ezekiel chapter 37. And we understand those bones, that's the house of Jacob. Those bones have been in that valley for quite a long time, and yet we're now in the season where those bones are coming alive, where bones coming to bones, sinews being put onto it, muscle, skin, and there's going to arise that army in the earth, and it's going to be the body of Messiah, his people, that are being awakened and being made alive again. Amen? And it's exciting to me, and it's interesting because so often we think about that valley of dry bones, and we think, oh, that's the scattered house, that's the lost tribes, that's Joseph that's laying in that valley. And it is Joseph that's in that valley, but Judah is also in that valley. Judah is also a valley of dry bones in a different manner than Joseph has been. But one without the other is not alive. One without the other has no inheritance. One without the other is likened unto dead bones. And it's only when the whole house of Jacob comes back together and actually begins to walk in the roles that they were called to walk in that you'll find that body rise up. And it's amazing to me because when you look into this Torah portion, I believe it's in this Torah portion that we see the very reason that body became a valley of dry bones. We see what happens in Jacob's house and why they came to where they are today, but we also find Yahweh giving a promise and a solution of how those bones will once again dwell, will once again Vayashev, will once again be settled in the land that is their inheritance. Amen? When we look at this, we find that if you read it from the surface, it's the events that lead to Joseph being brought to Egypt, all in preparation for being placed into a position in order to save his entire house. How many of you realize that there are times in your life where you may be feeling as if you've been thrown into the dungeon, if you've been thrown into the pit, that you've been rejected, cast aside, forgotten by everyone in your house? But Yahweh has a way of taking those very things that the enemy meant for evil and using it for your own good, and you'll find yourself placed in the days ahead into a position, I believe, that you will be responsible for saving your whole house. And yet when studying this, we find that it's imperative that when we look at these passages and these scriptures, that we understand that not only is it revealing things that happened in their lives of the patriarchs, not only is it revealing things that transpired in that moment, but it becomes a prophetic foreshadowing of future events. And we find that not only does this particular passage foreshadow the role of Messiah, as Messiah ben Yosef, who would also undergo the same thing that Joseph undergoes in this Torah portion, but I believe it's also pointing to a group of people that as well are going to function in the role of Joseph again in these days in order to save the whole house of Israel. In fact, if you are a believer in Messiah, I believe, therefore, he was Messiah ben Yosef. Therefore, if you're walking in his footsteps, you should be fulfilling the role of Joseph. Regardless of whether you are specifically from that tribe or not, as a follower of Yeshua, you should be Joseph. You should be fulfilling the mantle and the role of Joseph. And we're going to look at what that is. And today we find the position of Joseph, it's being restored. We find the lost sons and daughters, all of us that have been separated from our inheritance, from our very identity. We find that there's an awakening that's beginning to take place in the body. And literally the sons and daughters are once again taking on the mantle of their identity. They're learning who they were, and it's for the purpose of once again preserving and saving a remnant in the days ahead. Well, let's take a look at this Torah portion and see what insight it gives to us. We find, if we read here in Genesis chapter 37, verses 1 through 3, it opens up regarding this transition as the focus shifts to who is Joseph and what is his role. It says, "And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob, Joseph. Being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors." And so often we've taken these stories and they've become those stories that you learn as children, and you have this idea, Joseph had this lovely coat that made his brothers angry and jealous, but yet there is so much more to this, and this is what we're going to look at today. And it was interesting to me because there's a statement that said there in verse 2, it says, "These are the generations of Jacob." It's Elei Toldot Yaakov. And if you listened a few weeks ago in the Torah portion Toldot, then we've already covered the fact that there are 10 Elei Toldot statements in the book of Genesis. They structure the entire book. Each one is specific. Each one is significant and important. This is the last Elei Toldot of the book of Genesis. This is the last statement that's made here. And once again, if you begin to study those Elei Toldot statements, these are the generations, you'll find that almost always it's kind of weird with the generations, the way it's laid out. In fact, it doesn't even list truly the generations of Jacob. Here we find that it makes a statement, this is the generations of Jacob, yet, however, it only lists Joseph. How many realize that Jacob had 11 other sons, and he had one daughter, and yet only Joseph is listed? There's a reason. And we find that this Elei Toldot of Jacob, specifically Joseph, if you look in the scriptures, you'll find that it stands juxtaposed against the Elei Toldot of Esau in Genesis chapter 36, the chapter directly before this. And what's quite interesting, if you go and you look at Genesis chapter 36, the entire chapter is dedicated to the lineage of Esau. Esau doesn't leave out any of his. It lists his sons, it lists their sons, and it goes on and it spans out. It's literally a genealogy of the family tree of Esau. And it's quite interesting because if you know, it seems as if from the very beginning, Jacob and Esau have always been in this battle, one pushing against the other. And it would seem from the natural, well, if this is all a look at my genealogy, we'll look at mine, why doesn't Jacob list all of his? Yet Jacob only mentions Joseph. And so already it begins to reveal and seems as if that Joseph is going to be prominent regarding standing in opposition to this family tree, so to speak, of Esau. And it's also quite important to note that Joseph, this is the final Elei Toldot. It's the last one. All of these, I believe, become indicators that Joseph is going to be very prominent in these end days, once again, standing in opposition to Esau. And we find that Esau literally represents, he's a shadow picture of the anti-Messiah, the kingdom of the beast. And so we find that the role of Joseph now begins to take on a little bit more than we first looked at and understood. Joseph stands in opposition to the Esau of this day. But you're going to find that there's more to this role, as you'll soon see. But it's imperative that Joseph understand his calling. If Joseph doesn't understand his calling, if Joseph remains that valley of dry bones and does not rise up and once again take on the mantle of what it means to be Yosef, who stands in opposition to Esau? Who saves the house? Well, let's look at this a little bit further. The title Vayashev comes from the root word here. In the English, it says that, and Jacob dwelt in the land. It's that phrase, Vayashev. It comes from the root Strong's number 3427, Yeshav, and it means to dwell, to remain, to sit, to abide, to endure, to stay, to position someplace. It literally means to be enthroned, someone that will sit on a throne as a king or as a ruler. But it can also mean to give a dwelling to, literally to provide a dwelling for another. So when we see this statement that Jacob is now dwelling here in the land, it's not just meaning Jacob pitches his tent in the land of Canaan. It's literally inferring that Jacob has been positioned. He's endured unto this moment, and now he has been enthroned or positioned strategically here. And it seems to indicate that it's for the purpose of providing a dwelling for another. Could it be that Jacob has been strategically positioned here in order to give a dwelling to the presence of Yahweh? Which is exactly what Pastor David was alluding to before we transitioned into the teaching. All the focus is on the physical things that are being built, the physical coming third temple, the physical tabernacle in the scriptures, and yet the entire time Yahweh's point of view was always looking at the living stones tabernacle, the living, walking, breathing, dwelling place for his name. And we find that from this very title, Vayashev, it seems to indicate Joseph and Jacob, they've been positioned strategically. They've endured to this moment, and now they've been placed here to be a dwelling place for the presence of Yahweh, to literally represent the authority and the kingship of Yahweh in the earth. Amen. And we find that Jacob being positioned here seems to be significant because it's almost as if he's contrasting, so to speak, the position of Esau. And so Jacob being positioned here isn't just so that he can just have it, it's all nice and it's fun and it's enjoyable, but instead it's almost there's a military aspect to this. He's positioned here to defend and to guard something against Esau. Now, if we look at this passage, you find that if you look at this word Vayashev, the Hebrew letter Vav is prefixed. Well, the Vav deals with connect. It's a connector. It means to join, to connect, to make something a cod, but it specifically deals with connecting the heavens and the earth. In other words, the spiritual things and the earthly. It's a doorway. Something is allowed to come in and be made manifest because of the Vav. Then we find connected to this Vav is the Hebrew letter Yod. The Yod prefix infers he will be doing something. It's future tense. And finally, the root Shin Beit. Technical difficulties. Finally, the Shin Beit root means to return or to be restored. In fact, it's where we get the root word. It's the root of the word teshuvah. How many of you know what teshuvah means? It means to repent, to return, but also to be restored. When we look at this title, then, Vayashev, and we break it down in the Hebrew language, it literally indicates and is revealing that not only is Jacob currently dwelling in the land, he is Vayashev, he's dwelling in the land, but it's a prophetical declaration and promise of a future return and restoration of the house of Jacob. In other words, not only is Jacob dwelling there, but in our days, right now, he was already promising, Jacob, you're going to return. There's a day in front of you where there's going to be a restoration, and it indicates that Jacob's being restored and returned in order to be enthroned, to be placed into a position to, I believe, rule alongside as a co-regent on the earth, alongside the Messiah as his body, as literally the bride. But yet we find that there's a little point of position that Jacob has to understand. He is only allowed to rule and be enthroned as his co-regent as long as he is obedient to give a dwelling to. As long as he is walking and living as that living tabernacle of the Most High. Jacob can only rule and reign in this position as long as he is obedient to be a dwelling for the presence of Yahweh. The moment the presence is removed, Jacob is no longer Vayashev. He's no longer dwelling. He's no longer walking in authority. He's no longer positioned in that place of one that is able to rule and to reign. In fact, we find that when the presence was removed, it wasn't soon after that the physical children of Israel were then sent into the nations as well. And so it sounds as if in this title, Vayashev, that Jacob is being called to walk as a king and a priest upon the earth. And it's quite interesting because if this is what the Hebrew is revealing, what the language in the scriptures is revealing, that it seems as if it's only in this capacity then that he's able to return, to be restored, to Vayashev in his inheritance. In other words, when the house of Jacob learns to walk as kings and priests, that's when you will teshuvah. That's when you'll return. That's when you'll be restored. In other words, it seems as if Yahweh's waiting and he's looking to the moment when these dry bones are ready to once again walk in this manner. In Isaiah chapter 10, verse 21, we're told that the remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty Elohim. And when we look at these passages and it talks about the return of Jacob, it once again connects us to this title, this Torah portion, Vayashev, this future return of Jacob. It seems to be inferring that the whole purpose and intent of the remnant of Jacob being restored and returning is to once again Vayashev, to become a dwelling place for the presence of Yahweh, and as such you're entrusted with sitting in order to judge and rule in regards to the kingdom affairs. Well, how many of you realize that to return to the land, to return to your inheritance, to return back to who you were called and created to be as Israel, those who would walk upright, but to attempt to do so through any other door or through any other means than the restoration of the whole house, walking as a kingdom of priests and kings in the authority of Yahweh, is a counterfeit. If there's a return to the land, if there's a return to this identity, but you're still stripped of this identity of a king and priest, it's a counterfeit. Jacob Vayashev, Jacob returns when he's a dwelling place for the Most High, when he is a representative, that walking king and priest in the earth as a complete body, that's when he returns. And yet simultaneously we find paralleling Jacob's return, Esau is also Vayashev. Esau is also settling in. In fact, it's the exact same phrase, Vayashev. Genesis 36 verse 8 tells us that Esau is also Vayashev. He's dwelling in Seir. And so we find when we look at this, there's two kingdoms, there's two houses, and each one is settling in. Each one has endured to this moment. Each one has waited with collective held breath for this moment. Each one has become here in order to become a dwelling place for another, where one will be enthroned as king. And that title, remember, Vayashev specifically infers that it's literally an opening, a spiritual gateway has been opened. So not only does Jacob have this gateway that's opening for the presence of Yahweh to come and dwell in this living stone's tabernacle, but Esau as well has gateways that he's opening in order for another spiritual entity to enter through those gateways that have been opened. And so we find there's a counterfeit being raised up at the exact same time as the restoration of Jacob is taking place. That's why you see this here compared, Esau Vayashev and Yaakov, Jacob Vayashev. Whose house will you be a part of? Can you tell the difference? Because how many realize that if the enemy's going to do a counterfeit, he's really good at it. He attempts to mimic very down to the last detail in order that he can deceive almost all those that aren't going to be walking in discernment. And so we find there's a counterfeit being raised up at the same time as the restoration of Jacob's taking place. And it's quite interesting because in Genesis chapter 36 verse 7, we find that Esau and Jacob are actually dwelling together for a season. And it's only upon the separation, it says that the land could not hold them both. And so now Esau goes to Seir and he Vayashev, and now Jacob Vayashev. But for a season, they're together. And it's interesting because it's only upon this separation that now Joseph seems to come to the forefront. And I don't believe it's a stretch to wonder if Joseph is perhaps instrumental in this separation. And remember, we're not only talking about things that were taking place historically, but right now, do you think that perhaps Joseph is going to be instrumental in causing the houses of Esau and the houses of Jacob to be separated? Because Esau has intertwined and intertangled. Remember, Jacob masqueraded as Esau, but now Esau masquerades as Jacob. And yet, when Joseph steps to the forefront, it seems that this is what causes a separation. It causes them both to be revealed for who they are. Now, as we continue to look at this, if Jacob is to become a living tabernacle, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19 tells us you're to do the same. It says, what? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Ruach HaKodesh, which is in you, which you have of Yah, and you are not your own? So to this day, we find that the calling of Jacob is to be that walking, living tabernacle. If Jacob is to become a living tabernacle, then we find that this juxtaposition with Esau would seem to infer that Esau, representing the kingdom of the beast, the anti-Messiah, is at the same time also looking and seeking those who would become living tabernacles or a dwelling place for himself as well. Remember, a counterfeit being raised up at the same time. And it's amazing to me because all of the focus, it's smoke and mirrors. All the focus is on a physical temple that's being built. And yet, we find that Yahweh was always interested in the living stones tabernacle. Well, who do you think the enemy is going to be interested in for real? He's going to be interested in a living stones tabernacle as well. And so at the same time that Jacob is being raised up to be a tabernacle for the Most High, Esau is seeking those who will become his dwelling place as well. And now you can understand that Joseph, understanding his role today, becomes so significant. Jacob cannot stay intertwined with Esau. Jacob cannot stay dwelling together with Esau in the land of the inheritance, lest he become the dwelling place of another. And so we find that it's the return of Joseph. It's the role of Joseph that seems significant in the one that he will expose and get rid of and literally remove Esau from the land of the inheritance. In fact, when we continue to look at this, the value of Vayashev, it equals 318. It's interesting because it's the same value as the Hebrew word nacharim, and it means nostrils. But specifically, it's the nostrils of the Leviathan. This is the only time it's mentioned in the scriptures in Job chapter 41, nacharim. It's the nostrils of the Leviathan. And it's quite interesting because the Leviathan is understood, it's the beast of the sea. In fact, if you had tuned into the Exodus Plague series by Pastor David, he went into, in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, the beast of the sea, and he connected it to this Leviathan. Well, here in Job chapter 41, verse 20, regarding this creature, it says, out of his nostrils, out of his nacharim, goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. When we understand this Leviathan literally becomes a shadow picture or a picture of this beast in the book of Revelation that will come out of the sea, there's an interesting connection that can be made here because it's speaking of his nostrils, out of his nostrils, his nacharim. Well, how many of you realize that Adam was the first walking, living tabernacle? When Yahweh breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, he became that Vayashev. He became that dwelling place, that connector between heaven and earth. Do you think that perhaps this could be pointing towards the enemy's counterfeit attempt, where this beast in the days ahead is also going to seek to breathe into man in order to gain a dwelling place? It's also important to point out that the sense of smell that's associated with the nostrils is the only sense not compromised in the fall during the encounter with the serpent in the garden. We find that taste, sight, their ability to hear, all of them are manipulated in the Garden of Eden in their encounter with the serpent, but only the sense of smell, pointed out by the rabbis, is not affected. Do you think perhaps it's the intent of the serpent to now compromise this one aspect that was missed previously? How many of you also realize it's no accident that your nose physically is a direct gateway to your brain, to your mind, to the Holy of Holies? And so now when we see this title, Vayashev, Esau is dwelling, Jacob is dwelling, and yet it's connected to this idea of one, whoever breathes into you, whoever gains access to your mind, to this dwelling place, to this holy of holies, will be the one that you've become a living tabernacle for. And whether we as a people understand that or not, you better believe Esau understands it. Why do you think the days that we're living in, the type of testing that they're doing, it all deals with this area right here? This is a gateway in the physical. But anytime things go in this gateway, how many realize there's a spiritual implication as well? This is the Holy of Holies. His intent from the very beginning has been to compromise this Holy of Holies. Now let's look at this. It says, out of his nostrils goeth smoke. The word for smoke here, it's Strong's number 6227, asan, and it means smoke. But it's quite interesting because it's first seen in Genesis chapter 15, verse 17. And most of you are familiar with the scriptures. Genesis 15, automatically a light bulb goes off, and you know that's the covenant of the pieces. That's when Abram cuts a covenant with Yahweh, and the smoking, the asan furnace, and the burning lamp pass between the pieces in this covenant cutting ceremony with Abram. Well, it's interesting because this covenant cutting ceremony was the assurance Abram was given regarding the promises of Yahweh. When he asked the question, how can I know that I'm going to inherit this? How can I know that I'm going to receive these promises that you've been telling me? Yahweh's answer was this covenant cutting ceremony. Because if he does not keep his word, this covenant cutting ceremony reveals that what happened to those covenant pieces that have been split and divided, may it happen to me. This covenant cutting ceremony was the assurance Abram's given regarding the promises of Yahweh, the inheritance, and specifically the return of his seed. Because Yahweh reveals to Abram, your seed's going to go down into Egypt. They're going to be in bondage, but they're going to come out. They're going to go and they're going to become a valley of dry bones, but they're going to be carried out, Abram. They're going to return in Vayashev. Deliverance is coming. And so when we make this connection to this Leviathan, remember this beast has smoke coming out of his nostrils. Well, this term for smoke, this is the connection found in the Hebrew language. It's all about covenant promises, a return, a redemption. Well, isn't it interesting, though? It would seem as if the beast attempts to counterfeit these very promises. Perhaps it's alluding to a counterfeit return of the house of Jacob, an aliyah to the land, a dispersal of the inheritance. And we find that all of those that have been seeking and wanting this, we gobble it up. We take it in. And we find that this smoke that's being blown out of the nostrils of the Leviathan, these promises to come, to return, to have access to the things that you've been cut off from, you can return. We find that these words, this smoke, this breath that he releases is taken in by the people, and they never realize, in fact, it's Esau orchestrating this behind the scenes. And so we find that instead of Vayashev, instead of Jacob dwelling as a king and priest, representing Yahweh, walking in his authority, the people that are duped by this become puppets of Esau and a dwelling place for another, which is why you need to know, you need to hear from Yahweh specifically regarding the plans he has for you and the direction you should be going. Because we find that this beast system seeks to bring Jacob back, but not in the position of one that is walking as a king and priest. He will never welcome Jacob back in this role. He will only lure Jacob back and promise him, you can have all of this. You can have your inheritance, you can have your land, you can have your position, but you cannot be a king and priest. Let's look at Leviathan, this beast of the sea that's connected here. Leviathan is Strong's number 3882, and it's translated as Leviathan, a sea monster. But it's quite interesting when you break down and look at the roots of this word. It is spelled Lamed Vav Yod Tav Nun. Lamed Vav Yod is the three-letter root that forms the name Levi, the tribe of Levi. And it's quite interesting because whenever you talk about the tribe of Levi, you cannot truly talk about and understand Levi without understanding the role of the Levitical priestly system. It's so intertwined, it's connected. Levites, the priesthood. And yet we find when we look at this Levitical priestly system, the Levitical priestly system only came into place due to all of Israel, all of Jacob, refusing to walk as the living tabernacle, a kingdom of priests. When you go back and you begin to read in the book of Exodus, you find that when Israel is called out of Egypt, Yahweh makes the promise to them, you're to be a kingdom of priests unto me. And yet we find at the golden calf incident, they reject the role of kings and priests. And when Moses asks, who will stand for Yahweh, only one tribe answers, Levi. And so when we begin to refer to this Levitical priestly system, not only is it referring to their role in this, but it's specifically, I believe, pointing towards the fact that the rest of the house rejected this role. And so when we look at this root, Levi, in this word Leviathan, it's a reminder that the house of Jacob in the past has rejected the role of king and priest. It's connected to the other root, the Tav Nun, which in the Hebrew, it's Strong's number 8565, and it's translated as meaning a dragon or a jackal. The jackal is specifically associated with one who scavenges. They dwell in the ruins and the desolate places. And so when you look at this term Leviathan, this beast, it seems to be revealing that this coming beast can only take for his dwelling place those who have become likened unto the ruins and the desolate places, having rejected the mantle and the calling of being a kingdom of priests and a living tabernacle for the Most High. In other words, the only place that he can Vayashev, the only place that he can dwell, is a place that's already been Ichabod, a place that's already become desolate because they rejected being a dwelling place for the Most High. This is where he dwells. This is why it's so significant that you see that root Levi. It was a reminder, Jacob, you rejected this role. You refused to walk as a king and a priest. And this is why when we begin to look at this, the restoration of Joseph is so contested. How many realize that even among the Hebrew roots community, the role of Joseph is seen in different viewpoints depending on who you ask? Some are willing to let Joseph return. Yes, come on back, all 12 tribes. You're going to be one big happy family. But Joseph is not allowed to step into the role as king and priest, because Joseph exposes those who have compromised to appease the beast. This is the role of Joseph. This is why Joseph is fought against. This is why Joseph is contested. Even by his own brothers, Joseph is contested. And yet we find the role of Joseph in this Torah portion. It reveals Joseph is walking as a king and priest in the house. And so we find that these two distinct houses, these two distinct kingdoms are easy to contrast. We see the kingdom of Esau and we see the kingdom of Jacob, and yet the Torah quickly switches gears to making some distinctions within his, Yahweh's house. He begins to focus on the house of Jacob. And we find that with the promise and the responsibility Jacob is looking towards being entrusted with and restored to, the danger of this counterfeit cannot be ignored. Jacob must understand what it means to Vayashev, to give a dwelling, to be a walking tabernacle, to be a kingdom of priests, lest he be seen as desolate and vacant for another. And we find that this statement at the very beginning of this Torah portion, we're told that Jacob is now dwelling in the land, and it's contrasted with having been a stranger prior. In other words, Jacob has not always Vayashev in the land of his inheritance. There was a season when he is in the land, but he is not seen as Vayashev, as dwelling there. He's seen as a stranger. Let's look at the word for stranger. It's Strong's number 4033. It's the word magor, and it means sojourning place, but it can also mean dwelling place. And yet it's different than Vayashev. It comes from the root Strong's number 1481, Gur, and it means to sojourn, to abide, to dwell in or with, to be a stranger. But it can also imply to be afraid or to fear, and it's taken from the idea of one who turns aside for fear of something. It's connected to the root stem gerar, which can indicate to drag away in order to press into service, forcible servitude. And so when you see this contrast being made regarding Jacob, he is now Vayashev. He's now enthroned. He has endured. He's stood. He's here. He's been positioned into a place of authority. But previously, there have been those among the house of Jacob that have been a stranger. And it seems to contrast two types of mindsets that are found among the house of Jacob to this day. There are those who will yeshav. They're willing to sit, to remain, perhaps indicating a maturation process that one must go through in order to be capable of being enthroned, ruling and reigning alongside as a representative of our King. How many of you realize that Yahweh doesn't just take anyone and put them in a position of authority? There is always a season of maturing, a season of growth, a season of training. And we find that there are those among Jacob, they're willing to do that. They're willing to endure, they're willing to sit, to remain. And yet it's contrasted to those that are there. They're here, they're in the house, yet they remain a stranger. They sojourn here, but for fear of being pressed into service, for fear of having to handle the responsibility of the kingdom, they will not Vayashev. They will not dwell. They'll sojourn here, but they truly won't dwell here. In other words, there's people, individuals in the house that want the blessings without the responsibility. And yet this is now contrasted. Jacob at one point, this was you, Jacob. And yet it seems there's been a shift, there's been a change because he understands. He has an encounter with Laban. He has an encounter with Esau. He now understands what's at stake. He must Vayashev. He must mature. He must grow. He must be that dwelling place for Yahweh if his house is going to survive. Amen? And yet we find it's the very refusal to undergo that maturation process throughout history that has caused the house of Israel to be dragged away into forced servitude to other nations. How many realize Israel never went into exile until they first shirked their responsibility regarding the covenant of Yahweh, regarding walking as a kingdom of kings and priests? When they shirked those responsibilities, then they were dragged into servitude, into bondage to other nations. In other words, a lesson learned the hard way. And here we find this is why we are here today. This is why the house was scattered. And now we find we've come full circle, and it's now time for the house of Jacob to return. But has Jacob learned his lesson? Is Jacob returning mature and ready, understanding he must Vayashev? Or are there still those among the house that they'll sojourn, they'll dwell here, they want that, they want the blessings, but they don't want the responsibility? And yet we find Jacob cannot afford to miss it this time, can he? Because we find for those who miss this, they'll find themselves in forced servitude, but this time it'll be forced servitude to Esau and the beast system. If you look at the numerical difference between Vayashev, 318, and Magur, stranger, these two concepts that are being contrasted here, Vayashev equals 318 and Magur equals 259, the numerical difference equals 59. It's the same value as the Hebrew word nidah. Impurity, filthy, unclean, separation. It indicates the potential to house the seed or word, yet that's been lost. To carry it to fruition is lost until the next cycle in the natural. But yet we understand we can apply this spiritually. Spiritually, you can be nidah. You can be considered unclean. You can be kept separate. Why? Because the potential for you to house the word and the seed of Yahweh and carry it and see it made manifest, see it all the way to fruition, it's lost. You're incapable of doing that. A lack of maturity. And so it seems Yahweh is distinguishing between those who are capable of handling the affairs of the kingdom and being instrumental in its establishment here on earth, compared to those who are incapable of carrying the word, the seed, seeing it all the way to the end, enduring, Vayashev, staying, remaining, and enduring until it's done. Therefore, those individuals are exposed as one in a nidah condition, and while in that condition, they are incapable of walking in that authority that Jacob is being returned to. In other words, there are those that will hinder and hold up the restoration and the return of the house, because Jacob can't come back until all the bones come alive and get their act together and begin to walk in who they've been called to be. And so we find there's a season where that Yahweh in his mercy, there's a season where he allows a little bit longer to see who's going to mature in the house versus who will not. It's interesting because this term nidah, nun, dalet, hey, it's a cognate of another Hebrew word, naday, which means the pay or the hire of a harlot. In other words, those who will sell out, to this coming harlot system, thinking that this will give them the position that they desire without the work. They're willing to pay the harlot to get what they want, and yet they find there's a rude awakening coming, because when you pay the harlot, you now will be in forced bondage and servitude to the beast. And we find that it's here that the focus quickly shifts to Joseph. Joseph is the Toldot of Jacob. What Jacob has yalad, declared, produced, or brought forth. Joseph is recognized as the one that seems as if there's something about the mantle, the anointing of Joseph, that becomes so pivotal in this moment when the house is attempting to once again be restored. The role of Joseph is focused on. In the Hebrew, the name Joseph, it's Strong's number 3130, Yosef, and it means Yahweh has added. It comes from the root word yasaf, meaning to add, to increase, to do again. It's already an indicator there's a future event. This is going to happen again. He will Yosef the house of Jacob. This is going to take place again. It can also mean to join oneself to, and it's translated as meaning an increaser, repeater, a doubler. But it's quite interesting because the two-letter root of the name Yosef, the Samic Pei root, Strong's number 5592, means threshold, doorway. But it also indicates the one who guards the door as well as the doorkeeper. In other words, the name Joseph, it's identifying who Joseph is, what his role is in the house. He's the doorkeeper. He's the one that guards the threshold. How many realize that whatever crosses your threshold, it means you're in covenant with that? They understood in the ancient Near Middle Eastern culture, they understood that the threshold actually was an altar, and so it becomes a doorway not only in the physical but in the spiritual as well. And whatever crosses this threshold, I've now allowed to be in covenant with me. Remember, at one point, Jacob is dwelling with Esau. And yet Joseph arrives on the scene, and we're told that Joseph is the doorkeeper. Joseph is the one that guards the house. The name of Joseph reveals he will guard the door, the threshold, watching intently what the house is joined to or who dwells within. And now you can begin to understand, for any of those that have been walking as the Joseph of this generation, you're not popular, are you? Joseph is not popular because Joseph demands that there be boundaries. Joseph demands that there's a standard in the house. Joseph demands that not just anything is going to be allowed in this dwelling place, because Joseph understands whatever comes in and dwells here is going to affect my ability to be that walking tabernacle. Remember, there's a counterfeit dwelling being raised alongside the restoration of Jacob. It's no accident that the value of Joseph equals 156, and it's the same value as the Hebrew phrase Ohel Moed, the tabernacle of the congregation. Literally, the tabernacle itself was referred to as the tabernacle of the congregation. In other words, Joseph is the doorkeeper of the presence. Yahweh's presence dwelt in the tabernacle among the camp of Israel. So when we're told and we connect that Joseph is literally the guardian of this dwelling place, he's the guardian or the doorkeeper to the presence of Yahweh. Hence, Messiah, in his role as Mashiach ben Yosef, he fulfills this role. In John chapter 14, verse 6, we're told, Yeshua saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. He's the Yosef. He's the guardian. He's the one guarding the presence, guarding the dwelling place. Well, how many of you realize that Joseph today is also to be the keeper of the presence? We should be walking and functioning in the role of a living tabernacle, guarding and keeping the presence, which we are a dwelling of, ensuring that nothing crosses this threshold that's going to compromise that or cause one to become a place of desolation. Joseph is the one that guards and keeps the house. He makes sure that there's a remnant that's not compromised, a remnant that's not a dwelling place for the coming beast system. Joseph guards the house and says no. Amen? Which is why it's significant that Joseph not only understands his role, but that Joseph's being restored in this hour. Here we find Joseph is given a special garment reflecting this status. He's given a coat of many colors, or in Hebrew it's a ketonet pasim. And this term begs a closer look. The word ketonet is literally the word for coat. translated as coat. It's ketonet, Strong's number 3801. It's translated as tunic or undergarment, but it's specifically listed as one of the priestly garments. So when we are told that Joseph has a ketonet, later we find that a ketonet, that's a priestly garment. In other words, Joseph is walking as the priest of the house of Jacob. We're then told it's a ketonet pasim, translated as a coat of many colors, but pasim in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 6446, and it means the flat of the hand or the foot, literally the palm or the sole. The sole of the foot and the palm of the hand are always associated with authority and inheritance. This type of garment is only seen here in regards to Joseph, and also again worn by King David's daughter Tamar, and it's recognized it's a royal garment. Well, wait a minute, I thought Joseph was functioning as the priest, but now we find over here he's also functioning as royalty. He's a king and a priest, and his garment identifies him as that. Joseph's garments identify him as priest and king, as well as the one who's given the status of the firstborn, the one who controls the inheritance. And how many realize the purpose of the firstborn controlling the inheritance is that they are responsible for taking care of the rest of the house. They're responsible for making sure that this inheritance is going to continue, not just to their generation, but forward. And now you can understand why the role of the firstborn can pass over the physical firstborn. If the physical firstborn is incapable of doing this, then it will pass to the one who is. Joseph is the 11th son, and yet he's recognized as the firstborn. It seems to indicate then that the prior 10 sons of Jacob had already rejected or compromised this role, and it's made its way all the way down to Joseph. Are you beginning to see how significant, how attacked this role is? The enemy understands if he can keep the firstborn from functioning in the role they were created to, if he can keep you from being a king and priest of your household, then the inheritance is cut off. The dwelling place, the one that will guard the presence, is no more. And we find that he makes it all the way down to the 11th son is willing to compromise. Joseph is not. And we find that now this role goes to Joseph. And we find this is the same pattern, king and priest of Melchizedek. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, it reveals this role of one that would walk in the earth as a king and priest representing Yahweh, as well as this role points towards the Messiah, who is also priest and king after the order of Melchizedek. And we find that this is the very role that's rejected by all of Israel upon coming out of Egypt. They were called, just like Melchizedek, just like Joseph, to be a nation of kings and priests. Each firstborn was called to be a priest. They were called to be a nation of priests, not a nation with priests. There's a difference. And we find that because they reject this role, they reject the role of the firstborn, therefore it opens the door to the Levitical priesthood order until Messiah came to restore to the nation as a whole this role of kings and priests. And many people will take issue with that and they'll say, well, you're denigrating the role of Levi, but no, we're not, because Levi was the only one that said, yes, I'll take it. The other 11 weren't told that they couldn't answer and step up to the plate. Only Levi was the one in that moment that was willing to say, I'm willing to do this. And so literally when we talk about the role of Levi, it actually, in my opinion, becomes a slap in the face to the rest of the house to wake up. You didn't answer yes. Only Levi did. So there was still, it was evident there was the ability for them still to function in this role, but you once again rejected it. And yet, because of that, it's not until Messiah comes that now once again there's an opportunity for the whole house to once again walk in this role. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 6, it says, and that he hath made us kings and priests unto Yahweh and his Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. He restores this role so that the whole house can once again understand what it means to Vayashev, to dwell, to be that dwelling place, and to walk as kings and priests. Amen? Now remember, this parsha not only is revealing events taking place then, but it provides prophetical insight into our days as well. Joseph represents those who would take on the role of kings and priests, becoming a walking tabernacle, giving a dwelling place to Yahweh, specifically in the face of Esau's kingdom. And yet here we find a struggle that ensues between Joseph and his brothers. It's quite interesting. You never read of a struggle between Joseph and Esau. The struggle is between Joseph and his brothers, the very ones that rejected the role of firstborn, which is why it's now come all the way to Joseph. We find there are those in Jacob's house that will fight against Joseph, upsetting their elevated status in Esau's kingdom. How many of you realize that there are those that they have position, they have wealth, they have power, they've been happy to pay the harlot for it. And when Joseph comes along and begins to expose these things that are taking place in the house of Jacob, Joseph is not very popular. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, we read about the first encounter with the brothers. It says that he's feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. And then when we skip down in chapter 37 to verses 14 through 17, once again we see that there's an issue with the brothers and Joseph. In verse 14 it says, and he said to him, this is Jacob speaking, go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. And the man said, they are departed here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. We're going to look at this a little bit further, but it's interesting because the conflict ensues over how the flock is being fed and handled. Let's look at the word for feeding. He's feeding the flock. It's Strong's number 7462, ra'ah, and it means to pasture, to tend, to graze, to feed. Figuratively, though, it means to guard, to care for, or to rule. Conflict arises in the house of Jacob regarding who has the right to rule. I'm the leader. What I say goes. And we find that whenever Joseph begins to assert this position, he's walking in the role of the firstborn. There's a battle that ensues with his brothers against the authority of the king and priest. And we find that this battle is over who has the right to rule the house, and it's over who has the right to guard the house. Because remember, Joseph's role is the doorkeeper. And so it seems to indicate that there are those within the house of Jacob that don't want to honor the boundary lines established, but would choose to bring in things that would compromise the house, and therefore they take great issue with Joseph once again being restored and being found on the scene. They take great issue with Joseph, who has been chosen to guard, to care for, to rule, and to protect the house. Now, this term ra'ah is formed with the same letters in Hebrew as Strong's number 6168, ara. It's ayin resh he, and it means to expose, to uncover. And it can be used in the sense of exposing a woman's nidah condition. Remember the connection? Those that would be a stranger are seen as ones that are nidah. In other words, this argument over who has the right to rule and guard the house actually serves to expose and uncover the nidah condition of those within the house of Jacob. This is why the true house and anointing of Joseph is not popular until the famine hits. Because the role of Joseph is that he begins to expose those in the house who have compromised, and he begins to deal with it. Why? Because the house cannot afford to be compromised in this season. And we find that the main argument seems to arise between Joseph and the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. These are the ones that are specifically mentioned. Well, let's look at their names, because it's interesting. The sons' names are not listed, but their mothers are. Bilhah is Strong's number 1090, and it means troubled. It comes from the root word bala, meaning to trouble, to fear, to be terrified, to cause anyone's mind to be cast down, literally to be weak in intellect. Do you think that maybe this is identifying those who have already allowed their minds, literally the Holy of Holies, this dwelling place, to be compromised and cast down? They are weak in this area. Their mind has already been cast down, and because that mind has been cast down, they're now terrified regarding the compromise they have made. It's interesting because Bala is also connected to the same root stem as the word used in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, regarding the actions of the anti-Messiah who will seek to wear out, to Bala, the saints of the Most High. And it's quite interesting because here in the house of Jacob, we already have some sons identified as those that it seems if they've already been worn out. They've already been troubled. Their minds have already been weakened regarding this coming onslaught. He is also with the sons of Zilpah. Strong's number 2153. Zilpah is translated as meaning a trickling. It comes from the root stem, the Zayin Lamed comes from the root Zalal, and it means to be worthless, vile, insignificant, to be of little value, or to lightly esteem something. And the Zayin Lamed is connected to the root word pei, Zilpah. Well, the pei, hey root can also be translated as meaning the mouth. In other words, the sons of Zilpah are identified as those who give little value or consider worthless and insignificant the words that are coming forth from the mouth. The sons of Zilpah are those who give little value or lightly esteem what proceeds forth from the mouth, literally the word, and we find that their access to that word is likened unto just a trickle. They have just a little bit of word. They have just a trickle that they are given, and yet there's a famine coming. What are they going to do with the trickle of the word when it's cut off? What are they going to do with the very thing that they've lightly esteemed and given no value, and they thought it was insignificant because they have all the time in the world to do what they want? But when it's cut off and they only have a trickle, they only have a little bit, now you can begin to understand why Joseph has an issue with the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah. These sons are ones that have already compromised. Within Jacob's house, we have identified two categories of sons. We see there are those who will take on the mantle of walking as a king and priest, choosing to guard and highly esteem the responsibility of the covenant. And there are those who choose to compromise this role. And because they have compromised this role and lightly esteemed or valued the word that they were entrusted with, they will be those who are worn out by the coming anti-Messiah. Their minds are literally incapable of standing against it. And we find they're in need of Joseph. They can't stand on their own. They've already rejected the very role that they were required to walk in. They need Joseph. We find the conflict continues, though, here. We find that these sons are supposed to be feeding the flocks at Shechem. How many realize it's not an accident that he specifically says, you feed the flocks at Shechem? Shechem happens to be the inheritance of Joseph. It's translated as meaning shoulders. And when you look at where the valley of Shechem is located, it's the valley at the base of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, the mountains where the blessings and the curses were spoken when Israel later enters into the land. Shechem represents shouldering the responsibility of the covenant, which is what Joseph did, which is why Joseph was walking as a king and priest. It wasn't because he's daddy's favorite. It was because Joseph was willing to shoulder the responsibility of the Torah, the covenant, the word, to carry, understanding the weight of the blessings and the curses, should he be obedient or should he not. We find this is exactly what Joseph did. It's what Messiah did. And we find it's what the house of Joseph today is being restored to and coming to an understanding of what it means. This is why you're here. This is why you're hearing these words. You're learning what it means to shoulder the responsibility of the covenant. What it means to walk as a nation of kings and priests. The flocks, the people, are to be fed, guarded, sheltered, and provided for here at Shechem. And yet we find sadly that most don't understand that this burden, this yoke of Shechem, it's light. The yoke of the Torah is easy to carry. It's easy to walk out understanding and carrying this responsibility, and yet they reject that because Esau's over and he's dangling this little piece of inheritance, this little gift that he's willing to, Jacob, if you just come over here, I'll give you all this. I'll give you back your land. I'll let you be I'll give you position. I'll give you a name. I'll give you riches. And yet they don't understand that what Esau's dangling in front of them is going to lead them to an enslavement that they cannot have fathomed. Jacob will not be allowed to return to the land when Esau is the one orchestrating it as a king and a priest. He will return as a puppet, which is why it's imperative that Jacob understand you cannot dwell with Esau. You cannot fall for this counterfeit return that's being dangled in front of you. That's why Joseph is so significant. We find that instead of feeding the flocks here at Shechem, where they're supposed to be caring for the people, teaching all of the people the responsibility of walking as a king and priest, because it was never supposed to be a nation with priests, it was supposed to be a nation of priests. Instead, these other brothers are at Dothan. Dothan is translated, Strong's number 1886, it's translated as meaning two wells. Two wells. And it's quite interesting because at Dothan, they throw Joseph into a well. But when you break apart this term, it is spelled Dalet Tav Nun. The letter Dalet means a door or a doorway. The Tav Nun root should be familiar with you because we've already looked at this root word previously. It's the same root that's seen in the word Leviathan. It means dragon or a jackal, those who inhabit the waste and desolate places. So when we find that the sons reject the responsibility of shouldering the covenant, when they reject the choice that they're given to walk as royal kings and priests, instead they choose to bring the people, to bring the flock. They bring the entire house over to Dothan. And at Dothan we find a door is opened to the dragon, to the jackal, the one that will dwell now in the place that has become waste and desolate. Because when Israel rejects the responsibility of walking as a king and priest, they no longer Vayashev. They're no longer that dwelling place of the Most High. And now when the jackal, the dragon, the beast comes on the scene, they're seen as a place that's uninhabited. It's waste. It's desolate. It's an easy opening. And the door is open and he's allowed in. It's quite interesting because the Messiah also reveals this, that if he's to cast out demons from someone and they do not do anything with this dwelling, it's swept clean, and they circle back and they come back and nothing has filled this dwelling. They didn't put the word in. They didn't allow the Ruach HaKodesh to come into this dwelling. It's a dwelling place that's empty and swept clean. Then they'll come back in. What is it? 7 times worse. So we find that not only is Joseph charged with standing and guarding the house from the onslaught of Esau, the beast, but Joseph must also deal with those in the house who would allow boundaries to be compromised, which in turn opens the door to desolation rather than shoulder the responsibilities of the covenant. And we find that it's these same individuals who will do everything in their power to strip Joseph of his mantle, his garment of royal priesthood. How many of you realize that it was not Esau that rejected Joseph? It was his brothers that did not allow Joseph to walk in the calling he was supposed to walk in. That's not a pattern just for those days. That's what you're seeing now. This is why Joseph is so contested. This is why Joseph will be hated. And as the days continue, you're going to be hated even more. Why? Because Joseph exposes those that have compromised to the beast system. We find that if the enemy can trick the sons of Jacob into rejecting their calling as kings and priests, rejecting Joseph's role as the one who guards and rules the house, then they become easy prey and they'll open the door themselves to allow him access. He will not have to force his way in. They go to Dothan on their own. When difficult days come, when the famine is sore in the land, those who have rejected, ignored, and even despised Joseph will realize the only sanctuary will be found where Joseph is the doorkeeper, guarding the presence and keeping the way of the Melech Zadik, the righteous king. Joseph remaining true to his role. It's no accident that when the descendants of Jacob, the nation of Israel, are brought out of Egypt, they're instructed that when they enter the land, where are they to go? They're to go to Shechem. They're to stand at the base of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim and hear the words of the covenant spoken to them again. We see this referenced in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and Joshua chapter 8. It actually takes place. This pattern is going to be revisited when the remnant of Jacob is brought back to our inheritance. Once again, it's going to be via Shechem. learning to shoulder the responsibility of the covenant and to walk as a royal kingdom of priests. Jacob will not be brought back by Yahweh, instrumented by Yahweh, until Jacob learns to walk as a nation of kings and priests. How many of you realize that you've been called to be a Joseph? You've been called for this hour. This is the mantle that the body should be taking on. And yet Joseph has to remember, don't let the rejection or the time spent in the pit, don't let the time spent in the dungeons of Egypt deter you from understanding your calling and the mantle that's been placed on you. Because very soon the entire world, and especially the other in the house of Jacob that have rejected Joseph, they're going to hear these words spoken again. Od Yosef Kai, Joseph yet lives, and because Joseph yet lives, the entire house now can be saved because he has guarded and he has kept the way. This is the place of sanctuary where Joseph guards the door. Shabbat Shalom.